Hi everyone, it's Gavin again with a presentation of Act Three of All's Well That Ends Well by Shakespeare. Um, as usual with Act Three, with Shakespeare's Act Threes, there's kind of a lot that goes on, and you can see there's a lot of scenes in this act. Seven scenes. Shakespeare varies it up, quite often it's Act Three or Act Four with a lot of scenes. And a lot of short scenes, but in this one it's Act Three. Um, and in Act Three, we kind of shuttle between Italy and Roussillon in France. So what happens? Try to do this pretty quickly. In scene one, we get a little. Scene one is a little scene of the Duke of Florence, who, if you watch the Globe version, is fairly angry, uh, sort of tin pot tyrant kind of character who sort of yells at everyone on stage. And he's annoyed in this scene that the King of France hasn't given more of his resources and men um, to fight for Florence. I remember in Act One, the King of France said that he was kind of hedging his bets and didn't want to support either side, so he let his courtiers fight for either side. Interestingly, the French lords try to kind of calm him down, which he sort of does in the end. And later on in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the military, the kind of this whole subplot of the fight between Florence and Tuscany. It's Florence and Siena in Tuscany. In scene two, there's a couple of letters. There's lots of letters in this play. That would be an interesting thing to write about, all the writing and communicating and messengers going here and there. And quite often it's the fool delivering the letters. We're now in Roussillon, and the Countess receives a letter from Bertram saying, he's run off from Paris to, remember the fool went up to Paris to deliver a letter. Now he's bringing one back from Bertram to the Countess saying, "Sorry, I'm off to Italy. Um, I was forced to marry Helena. I don't want to be married to her, so I'm going off to Italy. And I'm never going to go to bed with her." The Countess is very upset with her son, and interestingly, really takes Helen's side in all of this, and she calls her son rash and immature. Helen then actually shows up in Roussillon, and she also has a letter from Bertram which she reads to the Countess, and it's not a very nice letter, and in it Bertram says, "If we're going to be really married, then you need to have a child by me, and you need to get this ring from me, this ancestral ring that's been in my family for years, and I'm not going to give you the ring, and I'm never going to go to bed with you." So great. And Helen and the Countess are kind of commiserate with each other. At the end of the scene, Helen has a soliloquy, which, if you've forgotten or don't know what that is, that's simply when a character is on their own on stage and it's like they're talking directly to the audience. Soliloquy. And we get direct access to the character's mind. If you're familiar with Hamlet, one of the most famous soliloquies, even if you're not familiar with it, the most famous soliloquy, of course, in all of Shakespeare is Hamlet's "To be or not to be? That is the question," from Hamlet. Anyway, in her soliloquy, she decides that she has to leave, and she's going to do it in secret, not tell anyone, and she's going to be a pilgrim to Saint Jacques, to St. James. I'm not sure if she actually says that in that soliloquy, but we find that out later. Act 3, Scene 3 is a tiny scene, 14 lines. We're back in Italy. The Duke gives him a position of responsibility. He's in charge of the cavalry, which may show the Duke's... which may show the Duke doesn't know very much about soldiership, Of course, all's well that ends well, as it turns out. But Bertram's not very sure about being given this position, but accepts it anyway and says that he will make the best of it. So another little military moment there. Act 3, Scene 4 is another small scene in which the Countess reads a goodbye letter from Helen. Helen has left now. She didn't tell anyone. She left a letter. Part of the letter is this absolutely beautiful 14-line sonnet, which is kind of miserable and sad about how she's gone off to be a pilgrim. Unusual for a sonnet, 14-line poem, usually a poem of love. This is very much a poem of despair and sadness. Countess is very unhappy that Helen's left, but Helen says she's going to go off and be a pilgrim to the shrine of Saint Jacques. Act 3, Scene 5, back in Florence again. So we're kind of Florence, France, Florence, France, Florence. And the last 3 scenes are actually Florence. Scene 5 is a slightly bigger scene, and we meet some new characters. We meet Diana, a young woman, a widow, her mother, and Mariana, a neighbour, friend of her mother's. I think we've got to assume that Diana and her mum are of reasonably good stock, because Bertram is making a play for her. You know, the reason I say that is because he rejected Helena out of turn for being not of the right social class. Maybe I'm making a wrong assumption. Maybe it's okay for him. It doesn't really matter what social class she is if Bertram's just playing around with Diana. But anyway, Diana, widow, and Mariana are waiting around. They've heard that they know about the French soldiers. They've presumably seen them. Diana thinks that Bertram's really good looking. They're victorious. They're waiting for them to sort of process past. Very excited. But then Helen shows up as a pilgrim, and she discovers that Bertram has been trying to get with Diana. The family take Helena in. It sounds as though they often do this with pilgrims. 3-6, we see the 2 lords, friends or compadres of Bertram, and they try to convince him. They don't like Parole at all, and they try to convince him that they should sort of hatch a plan on Parole to try to find out Parole's cowardice. And in the previous scene, 3-5, by the way, Parole showed up and was worried about his drum. He's lost a drum, and losing the drum is like losing your flag. So it's kind of a sign of ineptitude in the field as a soldier. So in 3-6, the 2 lords try to convince Bertram to do this plan. The first lord actually leaves, and you see the second lord confides in with Bertram about Diana, who Bertram is definitely trying to be with. And finally, in scene 7, Helen convinces the widow to help her trick Bertram using Diana as bait. It's interesting if you read the scene. I think that the widow clearly, and of course Helena at this point now has taken the widow into her confidence of who she really is, that she's actually Bertram's wife. The widow does want to help Helena because of this, but money sure doesn't hurt either, and Helena offers a great deal of money to the widow to help her in her plan. Okay, so that's what happens in Act 3. But obviously loads more subtle details that I've had to miss out. So, and I hope you're aware of that if you read it closely. So a couple more slides today in this presentation. You may have noticed there's lots of stuff about the military. I mean, of course, there's this whole subplot where Bertram goes off to Italy, the French lords go to Tuscany to fight in this conflict in the century before Shakespeare was writing. A lot of parts of Italy, if you looked at a map of Italy from that time, if you go back to if you go back to, I think it was my first or second act YouTube, there was a map of Europe in 1600, and in that map you'd see that Italy wasn't one country. It was just like lots of little kingdoms, and they were often at war with each other. Here's a painting by somebody who grew up in Tuscany in, just generation before Shakespeare, Giorgio Vasari, and this is his Battle of Marciano probably. One of many paintings of battles from Italy in that time. So, yeah, maybe Shakespeare has some historical accuracy, although actually we haven't talked about this. The story of this play Shakespeare took from a medieval text called the Decameron by a writer called Boccaccio, which is much older. It's like, 14th century, or is it 13th century? But the Decameron is these medieval periods through Shakespeare's time, these kind of wars between kingdoms in Italy were very common. So it's historically, there's some truth to it, but really I think Shakespeare's using this military stuff as a bit of a metaphor, because he uses it constantly, doesn't he, for the relationship between men and women. And women are often saying, how do I defend myself against men? And women often feel as though they're being besieged by men when they're trying to go to bed with them. And the best example of that, of course, is going to happen in Act 4 with Diana. That's coming up. But look at just some of the language here in these bullet points here. So in Act 3, Scene 7, Helena says to the widow, the Count, which is Bertram, lays down his wanton siege before her beauty. So the military word siege there. And earlier on, we get this right from the beginning of the play. Act 1, Scene 1, Helen had said to Parole, they were having that bantering conversation about virginity. And Helen says, man is enemy to virginity. How may we barricado it against him? So military term, barricado, a big sort of military barricade. And you'll see these all the way through the play. In fact, just after that barricado moment, there's all sorts of jokes about, doesn't Parole say something like, yeah, I'd blow you up, or he could blow you up, which is obviously military explosion, but it's also a pun on making a woman pregnant, blowing her up, right? So look out for that vocabulary all the way through. By the way, the word conceit up here is, you might know the word conceited, meaning proud, but in Shakespeare's time, the word conceit, and we still use it today in literature, it just means an extended metaphor. So you go ahead and use that if you're talking about Shakespeare. Instead of saying a military metaphor, you can say a military conceit. One of the things I think is really fascinating about this play is, I'll just put myself here for a minute, is this idea of a female community in the play that sticks up for each other. And you really see that in Act 3, although you've kind of already seen it with Helena and the Countess. Helena and the Countess, where the Countess even sticks up for Helena over her own son. Here's one of my favourite paintings on the left. It's by a Victorian painter, Henry Holiday, and it's of a medieval scene in Tuscany, in Florence, actually. It's a famous writer called Dante. Here he is with his famous red cap. And he's looking at the woman that he spent his whole life adoring. Her name was Beatrice. She's in the white. And she's flanked by her two friends. The reason I like this painting, or for you today, is that it shows you that kind of friendship between women. And Dante writes about this moment where he feels as though Dante's friends were Beatrice's friends were kind of guarding her, or perhaps he couldn't get to her to talk to her because they were They were with her, protecting her. So I kind of thought about this because it's medieval, like the source of this play. Boccaccio was just before Dante, and also because it's in Florence. Kind of on the topic too is Shakespeare and women. Here's one of my favorite quotes by a strong woman in Shakespeare. It's by Emilia, who is a Desdemona's servant in the play Othello, the tragedy Othello. And she says to Desdemona's kind of upset with her husband and is wondering why men act the way they do. And Emilia has no there's no qualms about saying that men have double standards, that men will say whatever they need to say in a certain situation to get what they want. And she also says cheekily, perhaps, if we're naughty, if we act ill, then it's only because they instruct us to be ill in the first place. So here, have we not affections, we being women, desires for sport and frailty as men have? Then let them use us well. Let them treat us properly. Otherwise, let them know the ills we do, the bad things we do, their bad things instruct us. So their bad things, their naughty things, their immoral things instruct us. They're the ones who are teaching us to be bad. Sorry about the sounds of little bells. That's my dog Quincy, who's constantly shaking his little Tibetan bells. If you can hear them, I'm not sure if you can hear them. Anyway, I'm going to put my head over here. I kind of said this already, but here in 3-5, we meet Diana, we meet the widow, we meet Mariana, and they're kind of a protective shield against the predatory threat of males. And they willingly take in Helena, I keep calling her Helena. I suppose Helena would be in Italian. England, Helena. They willingly take her in. And I suppose that's what they do anyway with pilgrims, but still there's a sense of them all helping and supporting each other. And yes, money does grease the wheel in Act 3, Scene 7, but still I think Diana really proves herself in this act, and particularly later in Act 4 and Act 5, to have a really strong moral compass, particularly compared with Bertram. Here's an exchange which you read. It's in Act 3, Scene 5. Mariana, the neighbour, who you could see as being a bit sort of tough and extreme maybe, but she kind of warns the widow and Diana. Mariana says, when this is very common in Shakespeare's time, to think of honor or chastity or virginity as the one thing that a woman needs to keep, needs to preserve in this patriarchal society, because of course women are judged on that kind of purity. So Mariana says, the honor of a maid is her name, and no legacy is so rich as honesty. And the widow says, I have told my neighbour how you have been solicited by a gentleman, his companion. So that's Parole has been coming to talk to Diana on behalf of Bertram. And Mariana says, I know that knave. Hang him, one Parole, a filthy officer. He is in those suggestions for the young Earl. Beware of them, Diana. Their promises, enticements, oaths, tokens, and all these engines of lust are not the things they go under. Many a maid hath been seduced by them. So in other words, don't believe these enticements and oaths and tokens. And that's what this go under business means. Because they only want one thing. They want your body, and once they're done with you, then your reputation will be ruined. Well, I'm excited to go on to Act 4. I hope you are too, and I'll see you next time. Bye.